Lesson 14 is the easiest one of the year. If you've done the rest of the lessons, you'll see how easy this is. The main point is the third conjugation and the third I conjugation. The book prefers the term third IO, but I don't understand why you would call it IO when you're really dealing with an I, not an IO. At any rate, the third conjugation. You've dealt with the first and second conjugation exclusively so far. Now you're going to add the third conjugation and the third I. There's only one conjugation after that, the fourth conjugation. And the fourth conjugation is, again, super simple if you understand the first, the second, the third, and third I. In general, the first and second behave like each other. In general, the third and third I behave like each other. The fourth splits its loyalty between the first and the second, and the third and the third I. The first thing you have to start with any of these conjugations to understand verbs is the lexical entry, how it looks in the dictionary. If you can't do that, you can't do anything else. A dictionary is not the same as the English dictionary, so you have to master the stupid conventions of a Latin dictionary. I apologize for that on behalf of Latin dictionaries. So the lexical entry starts out with an O in the first principal part and an ERE in the second principal part. Look at the model down here. In the first principal part, you have an O. It ends with an O. In the second principal part, it ends with an ERE. You could argue that this is confusing when you compare it to a second conjugation verb like moneo, monera. If you look at moneo, monera, it ends in ERE, just like this one ends in ERE. The difference is it has an EO in the first principal part, whereas the first principal part of the third conjugation ends in O. So there's never any way to confuse them if you know the first two principal parts, which you always will if you have access to a dictionary. You are not native speakers of Latin, so you have to use a dictionary. Therefore, there's never a problem. And if you were native speakers of Latin, then there wouldn't be a problem either, because you would know this naturally and intuitively. Now, the book will put long marks over the E for the second conjugation. But I've told you this already, that big girl and big boy books do not have long and short marks. Ancient manuscripts and ancient inscriptions do not have long and short marks. The long and short marks are a deceptive way to make things easier for you, but it doesn't actually help you in the end. So you got the model for your principal part right here. It's an O and an ERE. That distinguishes it from the second conjugation. And now I'll show you how to conjugate the various tenses. Once you've already got these down for the first and second conjugation, all the rest of the conjugations should come pretty easily. Conjugation of the indicative present active. That's a good review for you of what you've learned so far too. It's always mood, tense, and voice. I know in a regular English class or a French class or a Spanish class, you focus mostly on tense. You might speak a little tiny bit about voice, and nobody in your average modern language class will ever mention mood, but you've got to understand mood in Latin for sure. To do the conjugation of the indicative present active, you take the second principal part, you drop the ERE. Note that this is different. In the first conjugation, you drop the RE. In the second conjugation, you drop the RE. In the third conjugation, you take the second principal part and drop the ERE, not just the RE. You have to understand that the pattern is era. And then you add your regular old endings. So for the model verb that I gave you, third conjugation verb, sorry, I had to move it back there so you could see it, dico, dicera, dixi. You take the second principal part, which is dicera. You drop the ERE, not just the RE like for the first and second conjugation. And then you add the endings. DICO, DICIS, IT, I-M-U-S, I-T-I-S, and then just U-N-T. This is not exactly the same as it was for the first and second conjugation, so you've got to memorize this paradigm, which is a model. A paradigm is a model. You've got to memorize this paradigm for the third conjugation. It's O, which is the same as the first and second conjugation, then I-S, I-T, I-M-U-S, I-T-U-S, and not I, but U-N-T. There is no I for the first person singular and no I for the third person plural. Those are slight irregularities that vary from the pattern you may come to expect. My method is simpler and, in my opinion, better than the way that the textbook explains it. If, however, the textbook method works for you better, by all means, use the textbook method. In the end, you need to be able to recognize and read Latin. You are never really going to be writing letters to Latin in any letters in Latin. You're never going to be writing novels or emails in Latin, really. So if you can recognize this pattern, you win. Use whichever method works best for you, my method or the textbook. Next point, the conjugation of, let me add the F in there for you, the conjugation of the indicative imperfect active. Mood, tense, and voice. Really the only thing I've changed there is the tense. Now you're doing the imperfect. You take the second principal part, same as before. You drop the ERE, same as the indicative present active. Again, for the first conjugation it's RE. For the second conjugation it's RE. For the third conjugation, just like last time, it's ERE. This will be the same pattern in this lesson when we get to the third I conjugation. You drop the ERE. And then you add EBA. For the first conjugation, you just added BA. For the second conjugation, you just added BA. For the third conjugation, you add EBA. So again, if you take your model, your paradigm, you have dicere. You drop the ERE because it's a third conjugation. For all third conjugations, you drop the ERE. Then you add EBA to make it imperfect. Then you add the endings MST, mus, tis, ent. Very easy, very predictable. You take the stem without the ERE, it works for every single third conjugation verb. You add EBA, that's the thing that makes it imperfect. Then you add the personal suffixes. All the personal suffixes do is tell you that it means I, you singular, he, she, and it, we, you all, or y'all, and they. It's a good opportunity to review how the imperfect is translated. If you would have, for example, this verb dikebam, it's a past tense. You'll translate it as I used to speak, or I used to say, or I was speaking. I used to speak or I was speaking. There's your normal translation for the indicative imperfect active. The next tense would be the conjugation of the indicative perfect active. This is very simple. Here there are very little variations. You take the third principal part. In this case, for the paradigm that we've been using, you'd start out with the word third principal part, dixi. You would drop the I, because that's what you always drop for the third principal part. And then you add the endings dixi, dixisti, dixit, diximus, dixistis, and dixerunt, or dixera. You have to know both of the options for the third person plural. Third person plural, second person plural, first person plural. I'm just labeling these to review with you. third singular, second singular, and first singular. The translation of this is different from the imperfect. The translation is the completed action as opposed to the ongoing action in the past. Dixi is I spoke or I said, or I have spoken. Either one of those works depending on the context. Sometimes in English, I spoke or I said sounds better. Sometimes I said or I have said sounds better. Next would be the conjugation of the indicative pluperfect active. In every lesson I like to have at least one typo, and there's your typo that I had to cross out. I put perfect, but I meant pluperfect. Again, this pattern is very easy. You take the third principal part, as you do for the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect always. You take the third principal part. For your paradigm, you take Dixi. That's what's written in the dictionary. That's the lexical entry. You get rid of the I, and then you add eram, eras, erat, eramis, eratis, erant. Very simple pattern. Once you've learned these, and you should have learned them last semester, this should be very easy to you. The translation for the pluperfect is, instead of I have spoken or I spoke, you would say I had spoken or I had said. You had said. He, she, or it had said, instead of he has said. That's the pluperfect active. Third principal part, drop the I, add eram, eras, erat, eramis, eratis, erant. If you haven't noticed, these endings right here are the verb sum in the indicative imperfect. If that little bit of trivia is confusing to you, forget about it. But this is literally the same form as the verb sum, to be, in the indicative imperfect active. It should arguably make that easier for you to memorize, because you have to memorize that form anyway. Here's your second typo for the podcast, the conjugation of the indicative future perfect active. Conjugation of the indicative future perfect, not a tense commonly used in English, but it appears in Latin, and it's easy to learn once you learn the other ones. You take the third principal part, dixi, you drop the I, and then you add ero, eris, erit, erimis, eritis, erint. You just learned this recently for the first and second conjugation, so it should be pretty fresh in your mind. And this should be one of the easiest parts of this lesson, which is already pretty easy. It's the same thing that you've already learned. As far as the translation of the indicative future perfect active, you translate it as the odd, but nonetheless real tense, I will have said. You will have said, and so forth. You will have said. It's an odd tense. It's rarely used, but it is used occasionally. Don't forget that each week, along with these screencasts, I post the text of this lesson. So if you are listening to this or watching this and it's going by too slowly or too quickly, either one, you can go and just read the lesson as I present it, which may help supplement what the book itself says. Obviously, I teach it in a certain way because I find it to be easier and more efficient than the book. It doesn't mean that you don't prefer the book to these lessons, but I think these lessons should help clear things up and you can see it in action. The second major part of the lesson today is very, very, very simple if you've understood the first part. Roman numeral number 2 is giving you what the book calls the third IO conjugation, what I think is better called the third I conjugation. The third IO, or the third I conjugation, whichever you want to call it, is distinguished because you add an extra I sometimes. So I don't know why you would call it the third IO. Of course, I guess I do understand. I just think it's not the best label. The lexical entry is the first thing that you have to understand. It has an IO in the first principal part, hence the name third IO. Capio. And then in the second principal part, you have an ERE. This is the same as, the second principal part is the same as the regular third conjugation. So if you're trying to tell these two apart, you go to the tiebreaker, which is the first principal part. The third IO, or the third I, has an I, whereas the regular old third conjugation does not have an I. And again, you can distinguish this from the second conjugation because the second conjugation has an EO. They all end in ERE in the second conjugation. And again, this is technically a long E, this is a short E, and this is a short E, but no big boy and big girl Latin text has long marks. And no ancient inscription and no medieval manuscript will have long and short marks. So you've got to learn to distinguish them by looking in the dictionary and telling them apart by their first and second principal parts. Now you have to learn how to conjugate the indicative present active. If you understood the first part of the lesson, this is easy. Mood, tense, and voice. Then you take the second principal part, you drop the ERE. Just to review, for the first conjugation, it's RE. For the second conjugation, it's RE. For the third conjugation and the third I conjugation, it's ERE. So you have capera, which is a third I or third IO. You drop the ERE, which gives you your theme, and then you add the endings. Capio, capis, capite, capimus, capitis, capiunt. That's the indicative present active for the third I. This translates as I capture or I seize. Or you can say I am capturing, or perhaps I do capture. But if you want to keep it simple, and I recommend you do, I would just translate it as I capture. Here we go, I'm on a roll with the typos, conjugation of the indicative imperfect active. Again, like all imperfects in this class so far, first, second, third, or third I conjugation, you start with the second principal part. You drop the ERE because it's a third I. If it's a first or second conjugation, you drop the RE. If it's a third or third I, you drop the ERE. And then you add I, E, B, A. For the first conjugation, it's just BA. For the second conjugation, it's just BA. When you get into the third conjugation, it's EBA. When you get into the third I conjugation, obviously you have to have an I because it's a third I verb. And I've already told you that third and third I tend to behave like each other. That's why they're next to each other in the chart of learning Latin. The first and second conjugation tend to act like each other. That's why they're taught first and second respectively. And finally, the wild card, which you have not learned yet, is the fourth conjugation. That's why it's taught last. It's the most complex and complicated of all the verb conjugations. At any rate, you go back to this pattern, you take the second principal part, you drop the ERE for a third I, and then you add IEBA, and then you add MST, must, tis, ent. So you'd have cap, then you'd add IEBA, that tells you that it's imperfect, then you add MST, must, tis, and ent, just like you always do for the imperfect. The imperfect is translated as I used to capture, or I was capturing. No difference in the translation. It's just minor differences at this point in the conjugation. Any questions about that? Skype me. I can't hear you through the podcast. No surprises when you get to the conjugation of the indicative perfect active. Same pattern you've done for the first, second, third conjugation so far. You take the third principal part, which in this case is CEPI. That's a surprise, perhaps, the third principal part. That's why you have to memorize principal parts. They're not predictable. That's why you need to use a dictionary, unless you're a native speaker of Latin. And if your parents raised you to speak Latin, you should not be taking this course. It's a waste of your time. So you take the third principal part, you drop the I just like you always do, and then you add the same endings that you always have for the perfect. E isti eat, imus, istus, erunt, or era. You translate the perfect as you always do. I captured, or I have captured. Those are your options for the indicative perfect active. Again, Skype me with any questions. Shout at the screen as you may. I can't hear you. Call me or Skype me or email me. Email me is the worst option because it takes time to respond to those emails, and you can't have the immediate reaction that I would have if we were able to talk on Skype. We don't have to turn on the camera, but I can message you with text on Skype and hear your voice and answer your questions immediately rather than you waiting 6 hours for me to notice your email. I don't want to reveal too many of my secrets, but if you notice the pattern in the typos, it's because I use this function, I control copy and I control paste. And apparently what I did for this text is that I control copied and control pasted the indicative perfect active when I meant to change those. So the conjugation of the indicative pluperfect active for a third I conjugation is not in any way complicated or surprising if you learned the previous pattern. You take the third principal part, which in this case is kepi. You drop the I as you always have since the first and second conjugation. And then you add, just like you did for the third and the second and the first conjugation, eram, eras, erat, eramis, eratus, and erant. No surprises there. You translate it as you normally would. I had captured. That's how you translate the pluperfect. The indicative pluperfect active. And just to keep it novel and fresh and exciting, I handwrote this one, and also because everyone's sick of the typos, including me. To do the indicative future perfect active for a third I conjugation, it's no different than doing a third conjugation, a second conjugation, or a first conjugation. You take the third principal part, which in your paradigms example is kepi, you drop the I, and then you add ero, eris, erit, erimis, eritis, erint. Kepero, keperis, keperit, keperimus, keperitus, and keperint. You translate that like you would any indicative future perfect active. I will have captured. That's it for this lesson. It might seem long, but I imagine it's very, very simple because it's just the same old patterns for every single different conjugation. You learn the third conjugation and the third I in this text, in this chapter. And now there's one little bit about nouns. In this case, in particular, there's one little bit about pronouns. The kind of pronouns that the book focuses on now is personal pronouns, which you use every day in the majority of your sentences, I imagine. The word I, you, he, she, and it, we, you all, and they. In English, you don't think about it, but these words do have declensions. Nouns have declensions. I is the nominative in English. If you want to make something possessive, you say my, that's the genitive, or you could say mine. If you want to make it the dative, you say to me. If you want to say the accusative, you say me. And if you want to say the ablative, you would say by, from, within, at, on, me. And that's the singular. That's the personal pronoun in English with the declension. I, my, mine, to me, me. I is a totally different spelling than me. I and my are not spelled the same. You don't realize it, but you still do some declension in English. The word you is no different. You singular is the nominative. Your or yours is the genitive. To you, you, and you is the ablative. Not much declension for the second person singular or the second person plural, but you still do decline it in English, whether you realize it or not. It's more obvious when you think about a word like he. The genitive is his. The dative is to him. The accusative is him. And the ablative is by, from, within, at, on, him. For example, I went to the store with him. That's your ablative use. So again, that word is very obviously declined. You never learn that as in English in those using those terms, but English is an Indo-European language just like Latin, so you do the same processes. I'm just trying to point out that you do this in English even though you don't realize it. This is one of the few examples where you actually still decline in English. So here's the Latin personal pronoun in full declensional form, in the singular first and then the plural. Personal means it tells you which person it is. First, second, or third. And then, of course, it has number and gender. Pronoun means it stands on behalf of another noun. Instead of saying Sean, which is my first name, I can say I. So the nominative singular for the first person personal pronoun is ego. That's the masculine, feminine, and neuter form. I could write out ego, ego, ego 3 times, but it would be a little bit pointless. The genitive form is mei, dative is mihi, accusative is me, and ablative is me, just like in English. Note that these forms are exactly the same as in English. For the second person singular, you, tu is the nominative, singular. Tui is the genitive singular, tibi is the dative singular, te is the accusative singular, and te is the ablative singular. He, she, and it gets a little more complicated because for ego and tu, the masculine, feminine, and neuter form are all exactly the same. If you want to say tu for a female, it's tu. If you want to say tu for a male, it's tu. If you want to say tu for a thing, it's still tu. If you get into the masculine, feminine, and neuter, you have is for the nominative singular, ia, and id. The genitive then goes back to simplifying things, eos, eos, eos. The dative is ae, 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 again very simple. The accusative is a little bit complicated, eum versus eam and id, but you've learned to know that all nominative and accusative neuters are always exactly the same, id and id. Just like all neuters, nominative and accusative are exactly the same. And again, the dative shows some variation, ao, ea, ao. These are, compared to the other declensions you've learned, irregular. You must memorize these. You must spend a lot of time memorizing these, and this will be a major point of quizzing for the short term and for the midterm and final exam. If you can't recognize the personal pronouns, they're too irregular for you to just guess. These are the singular forms. The plural is also irregular. The nominative plural, genitive plural, the dative plural, the accusative plural, and the ablative plural all have to be memorized. They're all irregular. There are some patterns you can notice. Nos and vos, they're similar. Nostri and vestri have a similarity. Nobis, vobis, nos, vos, nobis, vobis. Those are all pretty regular. First person plural, we. Second person plural, you. And then again, when you get into the third person, they show variations in gender. The first and second person do not show variations in gender. The masculine, feminine, neuter are all the same. Whereas masculine, feminine, and neuter for the third person, singular and plural, show differences. They must be memorized. AE, AI, Ea. Those are not really predictable based on what you've learned before. They have some things in common with what you've learned before for 2, 1, 2 adjectives, but they're not entirely predictable. Eis, 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 that's easy because they are all the same. Eos, eas, ea, sorry. And then eas, eas, eas. Those are the personal pronouns. I, you, he, she, and it. Those are all the nominatives in English. And then the plural nominatives are we, you all, they, and then notice that English has no equivalent for the gender. They, and I don't know how you do it plural in English. Those things, or they. Those are the nominatives. And then, of course, those words do essentially decline even in English still. So those are personal pronouns. In English, of course, they do decline. They have a singular and a plural. I won't go through all the different declensions, but you know that you have the nominative and all the same endings in Latin as you would in English. You just don't notice them or think about them. You're never taught to think about them that way. 2 parts about this lesson. You have the third conjugation and the third I conjugation and your personal pronouns. That's it. 3 little parts of this lesson. Skype me with your questions. This is me saying bye.